It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Good afternoon. Now it feels a bit strange for me to be here in the afternoon because I worship here in the morning. In fact, this morning I stood right here as I was preaching the word. But to be here and see this place filled with lovely people and smiling, it's exciting. Yeah, and actually I'm serious when I say smiling because they don't smile so much in the morning. And that sometimes makes you feel like maybe you have just made some people angry by standing here. Yeah, that's difficult to translate, but I would like to say this morning, this afternoon, I would like to say congratulations to Rev. Parang Mung. On your installation or induction as the senior pastor of WACCC Christian Church.
WACCC Christian Church senior pastor se nakding rin pek nakonga ikibentugen kocha kanlungalom tikachim kudu.
It's a joy to us at the Baptist Ministry Center to continually be associated with this church.
Jun hikai Baptist Ministry Center jongkha hika krifa bumun katerian 20 naka kanlungalom tikchim.
And we pray for you a lot.
Jun zati cha jonga tampi thakan cham.
As we do pray for other churches as well. This afternoon I want us to look at the Bible. And we'll study from the book of 2 Timothy chapter 1.
2 Timothy angan pakhat Timothy chakot panhina angan pakhat inkan kan zaulai.
I'll ask Pastor Van to read from verse 8 to verse 14.
Pastor Van ni kan pakhat amhi paridin kan palai lit yang kha lai holina kan lit yak lai.
And then we shall immediately go into the word.
Madin chun pathian dia kan kan lutson lai kadak re lai. Chucha kan boy pa kong chimchu naning zakla achai thongtla pa kaima jong hi kaza pi la pathian ni tha jang an pek ningin thong tha chai temnak in kha ngam le lam ko pathian ni chun ama mi shim si oka akan kham I akan au Cucu kan matua mi ruanga silawin amani atin mi le vel akan ngai cha ruang tua kan asi hia vel chu chan ram thoklanin Jesu Christin akan pek chang semen salo tu chewa hin kan kham tu Christ Jesu arat nak thongin cucu kan sina phuan asi thi nak thon nak kha dong tar changi thi thiam ti lo nun nak chu thong thain kan sina apon chang Chu thong tha then tu dinga pathian ni lamkal tu le chompiak tua akaseri ibantugin sifa na ka in mi bialte na hi ruanga hin si asinain kalung adong nai sailo zaicha tia ka bo chan mi chu ahauda asika kanghali kakut chunga akapek mi thil kha khini tiang himte in aken khotika phiang ten kazum kan chompiak mi betak kha fekte in itlai naulo nan zul ok a ichia na chun Christ Jesu he nan ipet lai nak thongin kan ta si mi zum nak le dot nak chunga khan umpeng ko kan chunga au mi thiang tharau thon nak thongin nakut chunga chia mi thil cha kha kimte in keng na.
Thank you very much. In the 1930s and 40s, United Kingdom had one great prime minister known as Sir Winston Churchill.
United Kingdom timi ramne UK ne prime minister pakhat an ngai amina Winston Churchill ase.
Now Churchill was one of the greatest prime ministers that the United Kingdom ever had.
Churchill hi United Kingdom ni an ngai mi prime minister belte laka amak bik mi pakhat ase.
But by his own admission, He said that he was a man of many mistakes.
Asin natin amani awin khan mi chu kay mahipal nak tampi atwa mi kasiti ati.
Yet history has him as one of the big heroes that Europe had in the 1930s and 40s.
Asin natin tuan biani achimpon mi chu tongkan lezakwa somthum somliliwa kongsongan bigchu Churchill hi asiti ati.
He was great because of his fight against Nazism.
Ama himilian nga na si Zaironga tiya chun Nazism timi Nazi wara daw tu ase.
At a time when many leaders in Europe were afraid of Hitler and Germany.
Julio chan chu Hitler le Germany ka Europe rampini anak ti Leo chan ase.
Now, Winston Churchill guarded the values and ideals of the Western nations in the Second World War.
Dutia ka basit lewa Winston Churchill ni hen amani chun chu daw nak chu rakto mi chu ase.
He simply held on to one principle, the principle of right versus wrong.
Ama liwi adir pi mi nun ning je da city chun athami le achiami daw kasi amhan lo mi ka amhan min daw ding.
And with that principle, he pursued an enemy called Nazi regime.
Chu zum nak krampini chun Nazi timi Nazi wara ka rak daw.
Now, one time he made a statement,
Bikat chu statement pakat achim
and he said,
achim mi chu
history will be kind to me,
tuan bia timi hi kachunga atha komen
for I intend to write it.
Zaironga ti chun kay mahi chuk cha chun daw dinga kadir
And indeed, he wrote it.
asi achim bantukin adir tak tak
He wrote a good history.
at achim bantukin tuan bia tha ka adial tak tak.
This afternoon,
Tuan le chana
we are gathered here to witness and participate in a very important occasion.
tuan le chana hin aji chi tuk mi chan kan han leo chan ase.
It's important in the history of this church.
Chun hi kai krifa buton bia cha zonga aji chi mi tuan bia ase.
Today, Reverend Parang Mung can take the same words of Winston Churchill
Ni na hin Rev. Paramong ni hin Winston Churchill bantukin arian ka athok bet
but you will have to rephrase them.
ase makakawin chim than ding sia chun
And so we will say them differently.
adang ten kan chim haw nga
And probably you will say, Christ will be known among many people.
kan chim ha ding mi chu pathian he Jesu Christ he minung tampi sina athong kan thei tar
Because I intend to make his gospel known.
ase zai roati chun ama thong tha kha kan kar tar ding se
In my congregation and beyond.
chu chu de si chun hi ka kama kan khrifa bu se lawin kan khrifa bu long se lawin apin lei zonga chu thong tha chu kar ding
Now, such words have the potential to write history differently,
chuan tu bia le tha na ni chun tuan bia kha phundang te
especially the history of West Australia Chain Christian Church.
alain WA Chin Christian Church cha chun
Here in Western Australia, in wider Australia, and even the rest of the world.
ika hinum mi Western Australia long se lawin Australia ram pumpuluk balai pumpuluka
How will that history be made?
datin da tuan bia chu kan tial lai
When all of us agree over some very important issues that Paul raises here,
Paul ni hi ka chungi Bible cha chungi ar chimmi bia na he
and led by your pastor, making sure that we follow that.
atuazan laya ng pastor pani hin Paul ni achim ningin kan anun pi kan zul asia chun
The first thing that the Apostle Paul says about living such a gospel life
Paul ni masabige chimmi chu thong thabia ningin nun timi kong khase
is that the gospel itself is a message.
zai zatia chun gospel timi thong tha chu ama chai thong tha khase
And so communicate the gospel message.
chu communicate to ai gospel message kha chim ding se
It says that in verse 11,
chu bas palai khat na ka khana chimmi chu se
where he calls himself an appointed herald. That is a person who brings the news.
jo malama kha pathian ni au mi pathian ni thimmi ka siti kha chimmi chu se
He also calls himself an apostle
amalama zong kha zul tu tia ati
and a teacher.
chon piak tu ti zong ati
So Paul did not think or choose himself into that position.
Paul ni kan chukai dian hun chunga kan achimmi selo
He did not choose himself to be an apostle.
chun zul tu siding zonga kan amani achimmi selo
He was called by Christ himself.
pathian ni au mi ase
The reason Christ appeared to him
zai ruang ada ama sina boy su khrika lang tia chun
and appointed him an apostle.
ama kha azul tu sidinga rian apek kha ase
Now God has called so many people into his ministry, the ministry of preaching.
pathian ni hin thong thabia chim dinga minung tampi hi au na
He has called some to the ministry of teaching,
achep ka chu chon piak tu dinga au na
but he has called every Christian
asinatin
or every believer
zum tu vialte hi song he
to be a witness for him.
ama chai tete sidinga akan au mi kan se
So the preacher will preach,
za chun thong thabia chim tu ni thong tha chim lai
will give you instruction.
ama ni zul ding phungan chim na lai
The instruction is to make you better salt or light of the world.
chua chun chu an chim min ha ni chun hi valai cha cheu nak le chi te nan sin nak kha lang tar nak ding se
But the witness is all of us.
chui tete chu kan zapi te hi kan se
And so if Reverend Parang Mung is not going to communicate the gospel clearly,
Rev. Parang mung ni hin chu thong thabia chu tha te phiang ten achim lo asia chun
then we will not have a credible witness among us.
kan zapi te kar laka hin chu tete sin nak kha tha ten alang kholai lo
Because he gives instruction from the word on how to be good witnesses.
zai cha tia chun ama ni kan pathian bia chung in zai tin da pathian cha tete sin nak kha phiang ten achim ding kha
Now, Paul was writing to Timothy, a young preacher or a young pastor who was in the city of Ephesus.
e Ephesus Timothy kha minaute pastora si misina kan Paul ni instruction apek mi zul phung apek mi chu zai da sitia chun chu se
Now, there were many religious beliefs in the city of Ephesus.
Ephesus khwa zum ning zum phung tampi zul ding tampi lai
There were many also who believed in magic in the city of Ephesus.
Ephesus khwa chun cham thiam na ke azum mi jong tampi num na
And Paul was instructing Timothy to explain the gospel carefully
Paul ni Timothy kha tha ten tha jang apek e ral rin na apek mi chu tha ten pathian bia kha na chon piak na la na sin pian ha lai ti
so that the Christians who heard the gospel
chu ti chun khripa min ha ni kan thong thabia khan thai lai
would be better witnesses among those who practiced magic
chu ti chun cham thiam min ha cham azum min ha kar lak zonga khan pathian tete se na khan lang tar ko lai fiang ten
and those who worshipped other gods.
chun pathian dang abia min ha sin zonga khan chu lang tar ding chu se
There was a prominent worship of a goddess called Diana in Ephesus.
Ephesus khwa chun daina ti mi nu pathian bia abia mi zong kha tam pian um ha
Therefore, communicating the gospel clearly would make Timothy's congregation a better witness.
chu cha chun pathian bia ka fiang ten chim nak ni khan Timothy a khripa bu kha chu ka la ke min ha sina tete tha se nak ka fiang ten an lang tar ko lai
Therefore, the person who communicates the message has a different charge.
chu cha chun khripa bu pa kha da chu thong thabia fiang te chim ding chu be pi
And Paul encourages Timothy again in chapter 2, verse 15.
angan pan hi amel hai nga na zo na tha jang apek than mi chu
Do your best or do diligent presentation of yourself to God.
pathian sina khan lung sao te in na tha jang na nun nak di lakin na na pe lai ti kha ti
As one approved,
chun midang ni chaulan ok lak mi siding kha chim
a workman who does not need to be ashamed
chun rian kha aza pilo mi na silai ti jong kha
and who correctly handles the word of truth.
chun correctly
Who correctly handles the word of truth.
ma chun pathian betak kha tha te in akeng tu na silai ti kha chim
Now, Reverend Parang Mung,
chun Rev. Parang mung
for you to communicate the gospel clearly to this congregation,
da chun nang ma jong he hi ka khrifa bu sina pathian bia kha man te in chim tu na siding kha be pi
you will need to constantly assess yourself after every week, probably.
chun nang malai nang ma jong kha zar khat nu zar khat zar adi fa te kha nang malai nang ma sining khat sek kha be pi lai
Whether you're communicating the gospel or just condemning character and behavior.
nang malai nang ma kha pathian bia kha amhan ten ka chim ti mo na ti lai mo asilawa midang na anja za that lo na kha lang tar so men da karian tron na asiti kha za haulai
Many Christians in the church of God do not know how to live the gospel life.
Minung tampi krifa bu minha hi pathian thong thabian ningin nun athiam lo mi tampi ha num.
Because they are taught behavior only.
An chim minha chu nun chen je za kong long kha chim mi tampi num na.
They are told, do this and do that.
Mi hi tua ti kha chim mi tampi num.
They are not taught that the most important thing is to have Christ as the center of their lives.
Aji chi tuk mi boy sukri ka kan nun na ke sen tha se na kong kha an ngan yan chim lo.
So when they are here with us, they look good.
Mati zawa chun atang ai min lo ko.
But they are only good for Sunday.
Asinate an chat nak chu zer pani cha long se.
They are only Sunday Christians.
An ni chu zer pani kri pha long an se.
You have been called not to prepare Sunday Christians for Sunday evening,
E zer pani kri pha se ding le zan lai sang nge zer pani zan lai sang kri pha se ding long.
but you've been called to prepare the church for Monday to the next Sunday.
Pathian nia kan au ti ka hin nikhat ni in an hu zer pani cha tiang kha kri pha se nak ding chunga kan au se.
So church, we need to understand the gospel is not just behavior.
Ta chun kri pha bu jong ni kan thai ding mi chu pathian thong thabia ti mi hi kan nun chen je za long a se lo.
Is making Christ the center and the Lord of our lives. It is,
Boy sukri kha kan nun na ka kan kham tu le kan boya alai phang kan che nak kha.
so that when nobody who knows us is around,
Chun ka hau po ni kan pong kam min ha ni kan chu kan sin na chon thai.
we can still say that Christ controls this life.
An hu ti ga kan nun na ka pathian ni an nun na khet la imi kan si ti kan thai ko lai.
We know that the purpose that God has called us to Himself
Pathian nia kan au nak aruang big dong chu kan thai lai.
is so that we may have a relationship with Him.
Chuti chun ama he pe tai na kha kan ngai lai.
It's not so that we may be good looking within each other when we are together.
Chun alang kan chotik zonga pakala pakat chunga khan that na kha kan ngai ha lai.
So first and foremost, communicate the gospel. It will give us clear instruction on how Christ is the center of my life.
Chu cha chun pakhat na ka pathian thong thabia kha phiang te in chim le phuan ni boy sukri ka kan nun na ka rampi sen tha che ding ka se.
The second charge that Paul gives Timothy is in verse 13.
Timothy ni Paul ni Timothy sina achim mi apan hi na che se chun vas palhai thum nak chunga kanum.
And this charge is to Timothy to copy the gospel life that Paul himself has.
Chu de sitia chun Timothy kha Paul ni anun nak chunga pathian thong thabia anun pi ban tukin chu ra ka chong lo phopi ra ka tua te mi kha se.
And so there's a word that is used in verse 13 in English. It says, keep as the pattern of sound teaching.
Chu Paul ni vas palhai thum na ka chim mi chu mi rang holin chu the pattern of song teaching tia ti amhan mi chon piak nak chining chung nun na kha se.
Which basically means that what you have heard, copy it as a pattern of life.
Chu na thai mi kha asul lam chu na thai mi kha nanun pi lai chu ting te khan nakal pi lai ti kha se.
Now, the pattern of model that Paul gave to Timothy followed sound teaching, good teaching, quality teaching.
Paul ni Timothy sina athami amhan mi chon piak nak tia zul ding achim mi chu.
It is quality because Paul received it from the Lord.
Chu quality ang ai mi se je rong da si ta chun pathian sinin hu mi chon piak nak.
That's the gospel.
Chu pathian thong thabia se.
So Timothy was not an apostle.
Timothy chu zul tu se lo.
He was a pastor.
Ama chu pastor se.
He never saw the Lord.
Ama pumpakin boy sukrim hu balo.
He heard only about the Lord from his mother and grandmother.
Api le anu sin longin pathian kong kha thai mi se.
And then Paul also discipled him.
Chun Paul ni kan zum tu se nak ding cha disciple atu mi zong.
Because he did not see Christ, he cannot say, I don't know how to follow Christ.
Ama pumpakin boy sukri kam hu balo ja tinaka zulai ti kha thai lo.
He could follow Paul, who knew Christ.
Pathian athai mi Paul anun nangin kan Jisu Christ da siti kha thai ko.
Because Paul lived the example of Christ.
Zai ronga ti chun Paul kha boy sukri zum ni adu ningin anung mi se.
And therefore Paul now tells him in verse 10, chapter 3, verse 10, Paul says,
Paul ni angan patuam he patha na chim mi chu.
Paul tells Timothy, you, however, know all about my teaching.
Ka chon piak nak bel te kha thati nang hal di tia.
You know all about my life.
Kanun na zong nang hal di.
He actually says, my way of life, that is my pattern of life.
Kanun ning ka jia za nang hal di ti kha chim mi chu.
You know my purpose.
Chun ka tim mi ka yue che zong
You
nang
know
hal.
my faith and patience.
Chun ka zum nak le sitar ka du na ka zum nak zong nang hal.
You know my love.
Macun kan kadot nak zong nang ha.
You know my endurance to the persecutions and sufferings I have faced.
Macun zum na ka katuar in na katem in na kahar na bel zong nang hudi.
Basically, that describes all about Paul.
Ma biel te ni kan pola nun na ka fiang te lang tardi.
Now, Timothy knew that.
Timote ni kan at mati ka chun fiang te lang ha.
Paul confidently tells him, you know it.
Paul ni zum ngam te na chim mi na thai di te.
So copy that pattern.
Chu biel te kha copy to lo ra zul di lo te.
If the gospel has not just a good life,
Pathian thong thabia hi nun nak that nak ding cha long se selo.
but also has persecutions and sufferings that follow it,
Tem in nak tuar nak ti mi zong ni kan azul chi.
pattern the good life and the suffering as well.
Pathian zum nak ti mi chu nun chen za that nak kut life ti mi zong me khatalaya threm nak ti mi tem in nak le zong kam chiam.
So we should know as church that because we follow Jesus, we are going to be different.
Pathian kan zum ti ka hin kan zul ti ka hin kan idang kho.
You'll have a different mind, different principles that govern your life.
Nanun naka an foi tu thil tampi adang mi tampi lai na ro ning zong adang lai.
And guess what? The whole world is not happy about it.
Chibial te chu
The whole world is not happy about it.
adang pong kambial te balai sining kha kan nun nak cha anum mi thil selo min lai.
Don't think that the world is happy that you're different.
Balai ni hi namman adan ro nga anum lo ti rot sul ha.
The world doesn't like the fact that we always expose sin out of our own lives.
Balai hi kan ma kan du nak sung kan nun tik pawahin anum lo.
Because we live a holy life, we expose sin.
Cha de chun nun thien na kan nun tika sul nak kha that lo nak kha kan lang ta.
And so you might face suffering just because of that.
Ruanga chun tem in nak mi kha na in lai.
You might say face suffering because you are actually a Christian.
Cha chun krifa na si ruang zonga khan tem in nak them nak mi kha na tuar ko lai.
But because of that, don't stop following the gospel.
Churuanga khan boy su kina zul nak kha nangol lo ding kha aji chi.
We have the example of many who have suffered before us
Kan ma kan maya chubat tukin tem in nak atur mi tampi.
and they did not give up.
Antun biya kan zautika asungam pe balaw.
And talking about suffering, I believe that most of you in here, or most probably all of you in here, are here because of some suffering of some kind that made you not be welcome in a country.
Si tem in nak kan ditika hi kamun mi biel te hi tem in nak atur mi long te nan si nan tur in ruanga nan rama atum lo mi tampi nan min lai.
And so I feel like already you understand what suffering for the gospel really means.
Cha chun kar zum mi chu zum nak ruanga tem in nak tur te mi thatin nan thai thiam lai tia ro chan nak ngai.
But don't give up the gospel because of suffering.
Tem in nak nan tur ruanga zum nak khan nan kal tak lo dinga thong thabian nan kal tak lo dinga bipi.
Neither should you give up the gospel because of another good life that you are experiencing.
Cha chun temin na kan tur ruang zonga pathian thong thabia kha kan kal tak lo sung kan pek lo ding zong bipi.
Many have come into Australia,
Inong tampi Australia an ra
experienced the good life,
anun nun that nak tampian tong
and said, I don't need God. My life is okay now.
pathian hau ti lo kan nun na kha serem tuk chang ti ati mi tampianum.
It's not this life that makes us contented about life,
Ikai kan nun nak hi chutwa mena chun telai ichenat ding selo.
but God makes us contented about everything.
Pathian nin kan nun na ka ichenat nak mi pathian sinlong kan hu khomi si kan pong
So-
balayin selo.
So copy the gospel life that has been set forward for us as an example by many.
Cha chun kan maya alhana arak tur chang min ha tampi ni zum nak kha fek tin annum pi bantukin chu kan chon ha ding kha si.
Now, thirdly, the Apostle Paul gives another charge to Timothy as well.
Pathum naka Timote sina Paul ni achim mi chu.
In verse 14, he says, guard the good deposit that was entrusted to you.
Vas palhai linak ame palhai linak khanati chu nat kan chunga mi thiang tharau thon na khongin nat kut chunga chia mi thil tha kha kim ten kyang na te mi zon kha se.
In a way, he's actually saying, keep it safe. Keep the gospel safe.
Thong thabia kha him den na chia lai te kha se.
It's a good deposit.
Chu kut deposit ti an te.
He says you should guard that deposit.
Chu thil chu nang mani kan nakil kam ding ase.
Now, why should he guard this good deposit? Why should he guard this good deposit? Why should he guard
Okay.
this good deposit?
Zai ruang ada chu thil chu tha ten akil kami akil vending asitia chun.
Because it is the gospel of life.
Zai ruang ti chu thong thabia chu nun na kha apit lai mi se.
And then he answers how then you should guard it.
Chun na tinda na zul lai tinda na kil kam lai ti mi zong kha chim chi.
He says you should guard it with the help of the Holy Spirit,
Chu thil chu thiang thrau thon nak thongin na kil kam lai ti kha chim.
who lives in you,
Chun na nun nak chunga anung mi thiang thrau thongin na kil kam lai.
and who is the true guardian of truth.
Chu thong thabia betak akil kam tu asim mi kha se.
Now, we can be better at guarding the gospel
Pathian thong thabia kha tha ten kan kil kam kho ding se.
if we are aware of the threats that the gospel is facing.
Thong thabia kha ni aton mi ching chong mu kan telai kapol kha kan thai kho asia chun.
Now, in Ephesus, Timothy knew the threats towards the gospel.
Ephesa khwa chun Timothy ni thai mi chu zum nak adau tu thil kha dan siti kha tha ten ang hai.
It was worship of the goddess Diana,
Pathian nu abiami daina abiami zum nak kha siti kha ang hai.
it was magic,
Chun cham thiam nak kha siti kha ang hai.
and false teachings.
Chun amhan lo mi chon piak nak.
Now, false teachings were even much more rampant than the two that I've mentioned.
Amhan lo mi chon piak nak ti mi masadeu ka chim mi pan hi nak men kan achai ma deu ti nung deu mi se.
Because those were problems within the church, not outside the church.
Chu thil chu amhan lo mi chon piak nak ti mi chu krifa bu chunga se lenga se lawin krifa bu chunga mi se cha khan se.
And so Paul tells Timothy, guard the gospel in the church against false teachings that have come into the church.
Sa chun Paul ni Timothy sina chim mi chu na krifa bu chunga mi amhan lo mi chon piak nak kha makaka nakil kam lai nakil ven lai ti mi chu se.
Now, today, the gospel also in the church is facing huge threats.
Sa chun ni chana hin krifa bu chung zonga hin thong thabia kha chubantuk adau tu thil rala pe mi thil tam pian
One of the biggest threats that the gospel is facing is imposing our culture over the gospel.
Chulaki angan big mi kan chai rala simi thong thabia adau tu da city chun pathian thong thabia nakin kan ma kan nun phung kan kalchia kha be pideu chia nak kha se.
We love our cultures,
Kan ma kalchia kha yin che mu kha kan du cheu kan nun phung kha kan du.
but our cultures are not above the gospel.
Asinatin kan nun phung yin che mu ti mi he pathian nakin achung dewa umlo.
It's the gospel that is above our culture.
Thong thabia kha kan ma kan nun phung chunga ding ase.
Now, you have moved from another culture into an Australian culture.
Kalchia dan nakin Australia rami mi nun phung chunga kan rak thial na.
Now, some of you are going to quickly adopt into the Australian culture.
Minung tampi chu arang tein Australia nun phung chunga atlak min aziak min numlai.
It's again the gospel that will help you to understand the Australian culture.
Chun thong thabia ni hin Australia ya kalchia zong khathate an thai tar kon halai.
And take parts of it that are good, and that part of which is not good, the gospel says, keep it away.
Thong thabia ni kan chimmi chu Australia ya an nun phung zong he har cheu chu athamin numlai chu kan chon ding ase. Athalo mi thil ka chu kan kal tak na ding ase.
When we do that, we are guarding the gospel that has been deposited in us.
Chuti kan tu anak asul lam jada sidi chun kan chunge mi thong thabia kha kan kilkam na him den kan chia na asul lam ka se.
So do not stop guarding the gospel even when it seems unpopular to do it.
Chu cha chun thong thabia kilkam nak rian kha asung nan pek lo ding kha bepi chuti nan tu atika hi chu minung tampi ni andu lo mi thil apopula mi se lo ti nakal tak lo ding kha bepi.
Because some Christians will tell you, oh, now we've started doing things differently. This is the way we are doing it.
Cha de chun krifa min hani kan tu mi he adang den kan tu ton
We've started living our life differently. This is the way we're living it.
kan nun ning chu mi dang ha akhat lawen adang den kan nung.
You need to ask yourself, is that what Christ would like me? Is that how Christ would like me to live?
Chu na nun ning chu pathian ni adu ning anun ning asiti kana thai ding se.
If it's not, then let it stay aside.
Chuti asilawa chun pathian du ning asilawa chun chu tu chu nakal tak ding kha se.
So guard the gospel, contend for the gospel.
Chu cha chun pathian bia thong thabia te mi kha nakil kam lai chu ka chung chun lung sin na kha na ngai lai.
Therefore, these three charges that the Apostle Paul gives Timothy are the three charges that I leave with your pastor.
จะจุมโพลนี่ติโมเทสินะเบียปฐุมอาจารย์บรรทุกินนำพาสตอร์ปาสินาจุปฐุมจุจ้า
Communicate the gospel
เทียน
clearly.
ทองทะเบียคาเฟียงเตินนะโจนเปียกและนะชิมไลนะเปียกแท็กตัดไล
Copy the gospel life.
ทองทะเบียนุนนิงินนุนโคนักฮาดิงจานโคปินตัวไล
Contend for the gospel.
คอนเทนต์นะตัวละกอสเปลค่ะนันนุนปีนักดิงจานนันนุนปีไล
But remember, we are going to pray for him as he does that.
นั่นไทยดิ่งมีจูกันมาตรงนี้ฮีอปัสนันพาสตอร์ปาจ้าเปซุลเตดขากันสัมเปียกไล
You are going to pray for him as he does that.
จุดที่ละตัวนักจนนำมาตรงนี้ทานันสัมเปียกไล
And all of us also have the same responsibility
จน
of
กันซาปีเตนี่จูเวลเตจูตนเบากันไงดีปนฮะ
communicating the gospel through our lives carefully,
จูทองทะเบียจูกันนุนนักอินเฟียงเตนกันนุนปีนักดิงจะคอมมิวนิเคตัวดิงเรียนกันไง
living the gospel life that has been communicated to us,
กันสินิดพวนชิมาสิจังมีทองทะเบียค่ะกันนุนนักอินกันนุนปีไล
and contending or guarding the gospel that has been deposited on us.
กันชงเอวมีกันนุนปีจังมีทองทะเบียค่ะเปซุลเตนกันกิลกำไล
And with God's help, we will glorify God as we do that.
จะจึงกันตัวติกาจนปะเทียนเนี่ยกันบ่มไลปะเทียนมินสุนปานักอลังไล
Thank you very much.
ตัมปีกาลง